I don't remember exactly when it started. Maybe it was when I first said something important and no one responded. Or maybe it was even earlier, when my eyes searched for confirmation in other people's faces and found only polite indifference. I was there. I really was. But I wasn't seen. And over time, I began to think that maybe I didn't need to be seen. I learned to be comfortable. It wasn't a solution, it was an adaptation. A smile when I wanted to be silent. A nod when I wanted to deny. It's okay, when there was a storm inside. I became the background. People walked by and I didn't get in the way. I was the one who didn't cause problems. The one who was easy to forget. But something inside me didn't agree. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just quietly. Like a shadow that wouldn't disappear even when the light changed. I began to notice that in moments of silence, when no one was talking, when nothing was happening, I could hear myself. Not with a voice. And somehow differently. Like an internal movement, like breathing, like pain that doesn't scream, but is there. I was sitting in the kitchen, my cup of tea was getting cold, and my thoughts wouldn't go. They just stood there. Like people who don't know where to go. And then I asked myself for the first time, what if I'm not who they see me as? And it was scary. Because if I'm not who I am, then who am I? I began to remember the moments when something inside me screamed, but I was silent. When I wanted to say, I'm hurting, but I said, everything's fine. When I wanted to stay, but I left. And each such memory was like a fragment of a mirror in which I saw myself, not comfortably smiling, but real. Tired. Tender. Scared. Alive. The outside world didn't notice this. And I didn't blame it. Because the world doesn't have to see you if you hide yourself. But something in me began to change. I no longer wanted to be the background. I wanted to be the frame. Not the main character. Just someone who is visible. It wasn't a loud awakening. There were no tears, no music, no big decisions. It was like breathing that finally became deeper. Like a look in the mirror that you don't look away. Like the phrase, I am, that doesn't need to be proven. I started writing. Not for anyone. For myself. Sentences that had no structure. Words that had no addressee. Just a flow. And in this flow I saw myself for the first time. Not as a function. But as a person. With pain. With hope. With the right to be. It was the beginning. Not a revolution. But an evolution. And I allowed myself to be afraid. Because fear is also a part of me. And if I want to see myself, I have to see everything. Even what is uncomfortable. Even what is frightening. I lived in noise for a long time. Not in the loud one, but in what fills the space but says nothing. Conversations that don't touch. Words that have no weight. Laughter that sounds like the background. And I spoke too. I smiled. I answered. But inside I was silent. Because I didn't know what my real voice sounded like. One evening I was left alone. It was no accident. I wanted to be. I turned off the phone. Not because someone was annoying. But because I no longer wanted to be available to anyone but myself. I sat down in a chair, and the silence that had previously been frightening became like a blanket. Not warm, but honest. I began to listen. Not to music. Not to the news. To myself. And it was strange. Because I didn't hear words. I heard movement. Like breathing. Like pain that doesn't scream. Like a memory that doesn't ask for it, but comes. And I didn't chase it away. I listened. I remembered how I was afraid of the dark as a child. Not because someone was there. But because there was no one there. And that seemed scarier. But now I sat in the dark, and it wasn't scary. Because I was there. And that was enough. I began to write. Not for anyone. For myself. Words that had no structure. Sentences that had no punctuation. Just a flow. And in that flow I heard myself. As someone who no longer wanted to be comfortable. Who wanted to be real. Even if it was uncomfortable for others. I no longer asked myself if I was living right. I asked, am I living the way I am? And the answer wasn't always yes. But it was honest. And that was already healing. I allowed myself to be afraid. Not to hide the fear, but to keep it close. As proof that I was alive. That I felt. That I hadn't disappeared. And there was something tender in that fear. Like a hand that trembles but still touches. I heard myself. Not with a voice. But with a presence. And it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I spent a long time putting myself together from the outside. From the reactions of others. From the phrases they told me. From the looks I caught, trying to understand who I was supposed to be. And every time something didn't match, I thought it was a mistake. That I wasn't like that. That I needed to remake myself. To be simpler. Easier. More understandable. But something inside me didn't match. Quietly. Like a shadow that wouldn't disappear. I began to notice that some parts of me, the ones I had hidden, hadn't disappeared. They were just waiting. Like old letters that hadn't been thrown away, but hadn't been read either. And I began to open them. One by one. I remembered how, as a child, I loved to be silent. Not because I was shy. But because I listened. The world. Myself. Others. And how they told me, speak more, be more active, don't be strange. And I learned to speak. I learned to be active. I learned to be normal. But I lost myself. The one who listens. The one who is silent not out of fear, but out of depth. I remembered how I loved to write strange sentences. Without logic. Without structure. Just a flow. And how they told me, this is not serious. This is not literature. And I stopped writing. Because I thought my words were wrong. And now I read them, and they sound like me. Not as an author. But as a person. I remembered how I was afraid to cry. Because tears are weakness. That's what they told me. And I learned to hold back. I learned to smile when it hurts. I learned to be strong. But now I cry. And it's not weakness. It's true. It's me. I began to recognize myself. Not as an image. But as a presence. As something that doesn't need to be created. Because it already exists. It was just hidden. Under masks. Under fears. Under, you have to be like this. It was uncomfortable. Because some parts of me are strange. Unpredictable. Tender. And I was afraid that they wouldn't be accepted. But I didn't want to live for acceptance anymore. I wanted to live for the truth. And the truth is me. In all my awkwardness. In all my depth. In all my silence. I allowed myself to be afraid. Because fear is me too. And if I want to see myself, I have to see everything. Even what I don't like. Even what scares me. Because only then am I real. I apologized for a long time. Not always with words. Often with behavior. With a smile when I didn't want to. With consent when there was no consent. With a retreat when I wanted to stay. I apologized for my depth. For my silence. For my tenderness. Because I thought it was unnecessary. That it was inconvenient. That it was not for the world. They told me, you are too sensitive. And I tried to be ruder. You are too silent. And I forced myself to speak. You are too complex. And I tried to be simpler. But each such attempt was like a renunciation. Like a betrayal. Like a rejection of myself. I no longer wanted to apologize. Not because I had become indifferent. But because I finally saw, everything I had hidden was me. And if I want to live, I must live as me. Not as convenient. Not as understandable. But as real. I began to say no. Calmly. Without anger. Without explanations. And every no was like a stone in the foundation of my house. Because I no longer wanted to live in other people's rooms. I wanted to have my own space. Even if it was small. Even if it wasn't liked by everyone. I no longer apologized for my silence. Because silence is not emptiness. It is language. And I speak it. I no longer apologized for my tears. Because tears are not weakness. It is the truth. And I no longer apologized for my fear. Because fear is not shame. It is a part of me. I began to accept myself. Not as complete, but as alive. As someone who is still learning. Who is still hesitant. Who is still afraid. But no longer hiding. And that is the most important thing. I allowed myself to be afraid. And to talk about it. And that became an invitation. For those who are also afraid. Because fear is not something to be conquered. It is something to be lived. Together. Side by side. Without shame. I no longer apologize for who I am. Because I am. And that's enough. I thought for a long time that being myself was something that happened automatically. That it was enough to just be honest, and everything would work out. But it turned out that being myself is a daily job. Like breathing, which you have to remember. Like water, which you have to drink even when you don't want to. Because otherwise, you dry up. I began to live as myself. Not as an image. Not as a role. But as a person who no longer wants to play. And it was uncomfortable. Because the world got used to me being different. Someone who smiles when it hurts. Someone who agrees when they don't want to. Someone who is silent when they need to speak. And when I started to change, the world didn't applaud. The world was surprised. And some of them walked away. I no longer apologized for my depth. For my silence. For my tenderness. I no longer tried to be easy to accept. I just was. And it became my choice. Not in protest. But in agreement with myself. I started saying no. Calmly. Without anger. Without explanations. And each no was like a stone in the foundation of my house. Because I no longer wanted to live in other people's rooms. I wanted to have my own space. Even if it was small. Even if it wasn't to everyone's liking. I started writing openly. Without hiding emotions. Without smoothing out corners. And some readers said, "This is too personal." And I thought, yes. Because I am a person. And if my words are uncomfortable, it means they are alive. I allowed myself to be strange. To speak slowly. To be silent for a long time. To cry at films that others called banal. To rejoice in little things that no one noticed. And it wasn't a demonstration. It was life. I no longer waited for permission. Because I already had it, from myself. And it was the most important permission. To live. As I am. Not as expected. Not as convenient. But as truly. I allowed myself to be afraid. Because fear is not something to be conquered. It is something to be taken by the hand. And to go. Even if you are trembling. Even if you do not know where. Because the main thing is to go as you are. And not as someone you have never been. For a long time I thought that I had to protect myself. Like something fragile. Like something that is easy to break. And I hid. In silence. In smiles. In phrases of everything is fine. Because the world seemed loud, demanding, impatient. And I did not know if I could stand it. But now, I do not hide. I share. Not everything. Not always. But honestly. I began to speak. Not to convince. But to be. I wrote texts that do not explain, but simply exist. I left pauses that did not need to be filled. I created a space in which others could be themselves, without fear, without roles, without should. I was no longer afraid of being misunderstood. Because I myself did not understand myself for a long time. And if someone does not see me, it is not a tragedy. It is simply a fact. And I already see. And this is enough to live. And to share. I began to notice people who were also silent. Not because they had nothing to say. But because no one listened to them. And I listened. Not as a therapist. Not as a savior. But as someone who knows what it is like to be unnoticed. And there was more love in this listening than in any advice. I no longer tried to be right. I was real. And this became my gift to others. Because when you are real, you allow others to be the same. And this is the deepest healing. I left my texts in places where they could be found. In notes. In videos. In the silence between the words. And if someone read it, that was good. If not, that was also good. Because I was no longer writing for recognition. I wrote for presence. I allowed myself to be afraid. And to talk about it. And it became an invitation. For those who are also afraid. Because fear is not something to be conquered. It is something to be lived. Together. Side by side. Without shame. I learned to see myself. Not as perfect. Not as complete. And as a living being. And this is the most important thing. Because when you are alive, you can be. And you can share. And you can leave behind not an image, but a space. In which others will say, I can also be myself. This video is my attempt to be honest. If it left a mark, you can leave one too. Like, comment, or just be here. Moments Unfold is a space for those who are not afraid to feel.